Are we at the end of the Western era?
Definitely the end of this particular version of it. I mean, Putin has lost. He's failed. He failed to get Ukraine in the way that he intended to, and he's created just an incredible amount of devastation. Putin said, "Well, Donald, because Trump was saying they named all these things after him." He said, "Well, maybe they should just name the country after you." And obviously, I almost died laughing.
Welcome to the world of trouble, and I'm not going to lie, I've been really excited about this next interview victim that we have, who is Fiona Hill, a British American academic, diplomat, former presidential advisor, chancellor of Durham University, and star of the Brookings Institute in the United States. She's joining me from her offices in Washington, D.C. Fiona, that wasn't just flattery. There was a bit. But the fact of the matter is that over the last 3.5, 4 years, I've spent a great deal of time in Ukraine. And whilst I maintain my journalistic integrity and balance, I hope, there is no question of who is in the right and who is in the wrong, in my view. But that does seem to be a question that's been reintroduced to the debate in the West with the return of Donald Trump to the White House. Can you explain to me this incredible volte-face that he made in terms of withdrawing support for Ukraine that had been full square delivered by the Biden administration?
This has got to do with Donald Trump's worldview, Sam, as you well know, and I'm sure has been discussed many times on this program. He kind of thinks the same as the rest of these guys. He is very much the strong man in his mind. We've got loads of books out about this being the age of strong men, and he hates and abhors weakness. And he just perceives that Ukraine is weak because it's not a great power. And again, what is a great power? I mean, it's a very 19th century view, but it's one, in Donald Trump's mind, that has a really strong military and has the ability to push everybody else around, has the ability to set its own agenda, and actually has a sphere of influence. And related to all of the rather, shocking ways that he's talked about Ukraine, he's also talked with equal intensity about why is Canada not part of the United States? Why is it not the 51st state? Why should Greenland be part of Denmark, which is a country nobody's ever heard of, kind of thing, far, far away? How come Denmark has Greenland? Completely ignorant and willfully so of history of all of these different places. He just sees the map and thinks that should belong to him, and he has the same view, frankly, of Ukraine. It was once part of the Russian Empire. It was part of the Soviet Union. Why should it not still be? The big question, I think, beyond all of this about Ukraine, I mean, it's fairly straightforward about how Trump thinks about it. He just can't stop himself from, expressing all of this. It's kind of, stream of consciousness, verbalized all the time, every thought bullet and kind of bubble that one would keep to oneself normally, he puts out there. That's his blunt, kind of frank way of approaching things. Does he really kind of think that all of Europe, UK included, should also be in Russia's sphere of influence? Because he certainly thinks that China has the right to the sphere of influence as another big great power, and for Russia, he hasn't basically resized Russia in his thinking, that Russia is still the superpower of the Cold War, the major adversary of the United States. It certainly still is, obviously, on the nuclear arsenal front. But it's been a long time since Russia was a colossus astride, the whole planet, let alone part of Europe. And I mean, I do kind of wonder, push comes to shove, is he thinking that Europe is part of Russia's sphere as well? And I think that's up for the UK and for European countries to, reassert themselves in that space.
How do you explain this sort of from perspective of psychology? I mean, you've dealt with the previous Trump administration, you've been on the inside track, and you've been in the room with Putin and Trump and others, people at these seminal moments in history. From the outside looking in, it kind of looks like a man crush. I mean, what is going on there? Has Putin got compromat on Trump? Is Putin a Russian agent, consciously or unconsciously?
It is man crush. It's because Putin's the badass, kind of, in that sort of sense. He's what Trump would like to be. Trump looks at people who are, frankly, in charge of everything, who have the kind of basically the bling, they're emblazoned in gold. They're in gold, bold relief at all times, and that's what he wants to be. And he believes that he is elevated in everybody's minds by their association, by being in their company. And that's what Putin's got on him. Putin's got his number. I mean, basically, Putin realizes that it's the man with a very fragile ego and that it's somebody that can be manipulated in that way. He doesn't need compromising information. We've all got compromising information on Donald Trump. Again, he's an open book. But, what this is really about Trump himself wanting to be recognized by absolutely everybody who matters, and that's a very, small group of people on the one hand, but then everybody else on the other, as being, king of the world. And that's what he's talking about all the time. And he only gets that he has the approval of people like President Xi of China, President Putin of Russia, the royal families of here, there, and everywhere. That's kind of, basically for Trump, what really matters. That's the coin of the realm for him.
Is that something that Putin consciously exploits?
Of course. Putin always does things consciously. Putin himself is also vulnerable and, has the same, kind of fears that Trump does, frankly, of being, caught out, of being weakened, about, being humiliated. But Putin is also very much steeped in the history of his own country, just like President Xi is. I mean, he knows his history. He thinks of himself as somebody in a long line of, leaders of the great Russian state going back millennia. Trump is just Trump. It's all about him. It's all about his uniqueness. It's got very little to do with the United States. He's acquired the United States. It's part of Trump Enterprises. And in every different sense of that matter, this is all about him and how he looks. It's about how people recognize him. He's not thinking about legacy. He doesn't want to be dead. I don't think Putin and Xi want to be dead either. We got that hot mic, moment where Putin and Xi are talking about organ transplants and longevity and all the rest of it. But they do think of themselves as, basically the inheritors, the carriers of a legacy of a great statehood of, the Chinese Empire or the Russian Empire that has to be carried forward into the future. And Trump, it's all again, it's got nothing to do with the United States.
Got nothing to do with the United States, but is it that makes him particularly vulnerable to Putin? I mean, if you look at the kind of talking points that he echoes coming from, and we'll come on to Netanyahu later, I imagine, but if we're dealing with Putin, he tends to echo whatever Putin last seems to have said to him. I mean, and he strongly reflects the Russian perspective, which is why, and I was talking to some people in the intelligence community who kind of laughed off my question as to whether or not he was compromised or Russian agent. They simply said, well, you don't have to worry about the whys and wherefores. It is the that matters. In all things, he is likely or almost certain to reflect the Russian position. But is that how does Putin get that out of him, do you think?
He did it in part through flattery. I mean, Putin very early on, as I said, figured Trump out. And if you check very carefully, he is very careful about not to insult Trump. Even,
No
when he
disagreements.
is actually, insulting him, he does it in this kind of veiled, cloaked way that it's, lost in translation or glossed over in translation so that, Trump doesn't pick up on it. And of course, Trump's not getting packages of the kinds of rude things that are said about him in, the Russian press or, on Russian television or the way that, kind of he is presented. There has been a notice sent out in any case by the Kremlin basically telling the Russian media that being too rude about Trump is off limits. You can go after anybody else, and right now the UK is in the crosshairs in terms of being, the bête noire or the main adversary of Russia at different times. It's been places like Georgia or Estonia, kind of. It's whatever Russia needs as a kind of a useful enemy or foil in the propaganda realm. But they've been very carefully, just treading carefully around Trump. So that's how Putin keeps his powder dry. And he's got lots of things that Trump wants, which is, again, basically rooted in Putin paying him homage and respect and, and all the rest of it. And look, we've seen how other leaders have done this as well, glossy gifts, great awards, talking about, I mean, Putin's even talked about Trump getting the Nobel Peace Prize, not necessarily for, Ukraine and Russia, because he doesn't want to give, Ukraine up, and he doesn't really want that to be negotiated by Trump. But he, will say it about other things as well. They all know what Trump wants. And again, as I said, it's less about the respect for the United States. It's more about respect for him. And it is about the US insofar as Trump thinks that the United States is an extension of him.
frankly, have you seen Putin take the mickey? I mean, is there something, does he slightly play to his own, even local audience when he's dealing with Trump? Are there sotto voce pantomime asides about the widow Twanky from the White House?
I have, and one of the classic cases for me was in one of the last meetings that I, saw between Trump and Putin, which was at the G20 in Osaka in Japan in 2019. And Putin and Trump in the conversation were doing a bit of chest beating about nuclear missiles and about, whether Russia was ahead of the United States. And then they were also both bragging about how much they were respectively doing for Israel. And I mean, that might sound a bit counterintuitive, but this was at a period where the Russians were telling the United States that they were really the great protectors and defenders of Israel. This is obviously a long time, before the attacks of October 7th. And we'd had a meeting in Israel between the national security advisors of Israel, the United States, and Russia, and Putin was basically going on about what Russia was doing, and Trump was saying, well, no, there's no way that kind of Russia is a bigger supporter of Israel than I am, and was talking about all the things that he'd done for Israel, the capital to Jerusalem, new embassy, etc., etc. And then Putin said, well, Donald, because Trump was saying they named all these things after him, he said, well, maybe they should just name the country after you. And I mean, obviously, I almost like died laughing because, and I could see Bolton and a few other people, Ambassador Bolton, who was, still the National Security Advisor's mustache twitch, kind of, they'd got the point that, basically he was being trolled. But, the translation itself, was somewhat, glossing over really the kind of the way that Putin said it and the body language, the way he shifted in the seat. And Trump took it at face value and said, oh, no, that would be a bit too much.
Straight faced.
So it's just a total,
it was a
he
credible
just took it straight
idea,
face.
but
It
he
was a
wouldn't
credible
go for it.
Exactly, a credible idea for him. Why not name Israel after me? I mean, look, right now he's trying to get stadiums named after him, things renamed after him, from airports to the Kennedy Center, God knows what, the new Trump ballroom. For him sticking his name on things, be it a country or anything else, isn't that far-fetched.
It is pretty far-fetched, though, isn't it, that he is the president of the United States of America. Of America. I mean, obviously, there's the famous episode of The Simpsons, but domestically, we are living, the United States, you, an American citizen now, are living through what the Chinese curse would say are very interesting times. I mean, how would you characterize and describe the times that you're living through? Is democracy safe in America?
It's not safe, but look, democracy is not safe anywhere, including in the UK. And it has to be renewed by the people themselves. We all have agency. We all have a role in this. It's not going to be necessarily protected from the top when you've got people who are power hungry, which or in the case of Trump, hungry for so many different things. In terms of being recognized as a king, the head of the state, the greatest being in the United States out of 330 million people, etc. I mean, obviously the principles of, democracy and mass participation are out the window there. You've got to also remember that America is a much younger democracy, even than its 250 years. People will always say that America is a republic, and it was a republic of men, and it was a republic of a few men when it was set up,
Of few
including
white
13,
men.
exactly, and 13 colonies. It wasn't the America we see today. So much of America wasn't part of America. And it's really only in my lifetime, I just turned 60 this year, when you get the voter rights and the Civil Rights Acts of, of that period in the early to mid 60s, that you really get full participation in everything from, voting, to civic life. So, you've got to think that we're talking about an American democracy that's really been vibrant for about 60 years and has gone through so many ups and downs and trials and tribulations. And it's in trouble again. We're kind of going back on ourselves. You've got the breakdown of the two-party system. There's no question about it. Yet at the same time, you've got this really rigid and, deepening bipartisan sentiment. that's become, some people say it's tribal, some people say it's like, team sport, that, you can't imagine, rooting for one team over the other. You've got people who'll vote for Trump because he's seen as the head of the Republican Party, but the Republican Party's been taken over by this MAGA group, Make America Great Again, which also has its own trials and tribulations. It's a revolutionary moment. You've got Steve Bannon, who remains an advisor to Trump, talking about this as the Bolshevik Revolution, and himself as Lenin,
And that Trump is also an agent of God. I saw an interview.
Well, yes. I mean, you've got this in religious terms as well. I mean, this is one of these, kind of epochal changes. You can think about this as the end of, the Romans in Britain, or the end of Pax, Augustus, and all of the different kind of historic moments that we've thought of. This is historic, and it is a challenge to everybody who's living through it, to basically see if they can meet the moment. It's not going to be decided by one guy. And of course, we've got people like Tim Snyder, who wrote the book that remains on the bestseller list on tyranny, is always saying don't bend the knee ahead of time, in advance. We've seen this happen in so many other countries, in Russia as well. Russians pluralism; it's more democratic leadership, and the evolution of its political parties and the Russian parliament, the Russian Duma, was all thrown away over the last 25 years by people basically cashing in their desire for a better life with Putin, and in return, for not opposing many of the things that he's done. And that's, essentially what Trump is trying to lay out there. He's like trying to lay out a grand bargain, certainly with the billionaire and soon to be trillionaire elite in America, rather than the population. But he did tell the population, the people who voted for him, his base, that he was going to make life better for them. I mean, that's really why so many people voted for Trump this past time around, and really did give him a victory in the popular vote and in the electoral college. Like his previous election in 2016, it was because he led them to understand that he would make life more affordable, more things accessible for them. And he hasn't delivered. And so what he's delivering on instead is the kind of thing we've seen in Russia, of repression. Beefing up the military, and the National Guard's domestic activities, this explosion of ICE, which is immigration and customs normally, but now being deployed as a paramilitary force far from the international borders of the United States, Charlotte, North Carolina. Kind of the sort of latest victim of all of this. And again, it does feel very much like other countries at other times, and the United States at other times as well. I mean, it's in its history. It's just that nobody in living memory has this in their heads of something like this in the United States, so they're a bit paralyzed in trying to figure out what to do about it.
You've hinted at it there, but tell me more about what that actually feels like. I mean, what does it feel like to see ICE on your streets, to see the National Guard deployed, or the army deployed on the streets of Washington, D.C., the capital, of the threat of friction between the federal president and the states? I mean, these are the not just the constitutional norms, but the actual fabrics of democracy, to me, seem to be being rapidly unraveled.
Yeah, and look, I have to say it's a cautionary tale for the UK and for anywhere else in Europe and others watching this, because the United States has prided itself on being exceptional, and I've come over a long period of time to realise it's not so exceptional. So because many of the things that are happening here have happened elsewhere, either in history or in real time, so it's got this kind of feeling of a banana republic at the moment, or the communal violence is already there. Someone who grew up in the UK in the 60s and 70s, and I came out to the US in 1989, it feels very much like the times of troubles in Ireland. The kind of use of paramilitary forces, all kinds of excesses, that were, kind of carried out that kind of feeling that something could happen, that literally something could blow up at any point, and that we were far from resolving, these difficulties and finding a formula for that. And again, that kind of populist politics, Trump filling a vacuum, that nobody else has been able to come into politically. But again, this heavy-handed use of repression. America's had this before during the Vietnam War, other periods. And, again, it feels like all of this coming together and coming to a head. And, very much driven by the fact that so many people have ceded their power, including and especially in the US Congress, to Trump. And, again, the political parties are not really parties. Over time, it's become more apparent that they're just vehicles, movements, larger movements for the purposes of only electing a president rather than doing anything else in between. And I think that should be, very evident to anybody else watching this, that neither the Democrats nor the Republicans are actually real political parties, and that you've, really entered this realm of personalised politics. Look, the UK faces that. Why is everybody talking about Nigel Farage inevitably becoming Prime Minister of the UK when he didn't have a party to speak of? I mean, he's had electoral success in some of the local councils, including my home council in County Durham, but he doesn't have a political party, doesn't really have a platform. He scavenges on, various political issues, which is exactly what Trump does. I know I'm being quite harsh here. I'm not in a political party. I never would be. I'm an independent, so I'm going to call it as I see it. But people have to realise that they've got agency and they've got a responsibility as well. If you want to live in a country that is really addressing, some of the things you're most concerned about, including on affordability and, your chances of, living a decent life, then you've got to take action here and think about it, not think that one guy is going to fix things. And there's not one issue either that's at stake here, be it immigration or anything else. There's no silver bullet. This is going to be difficult. And that's what, real democracy is about. It's about your participation and trying to deal with the issues as well. You can't just take a vacation, a holiday from all of it and sit it out, because then things will happen to you inevitably.
The complacency may be allowing Trump to get away with what he's done so far, in the view of his critics. And I'm on the record for a lot of criticism of Donald Trump, and you're hinting there that the Democratic Party has really not got its act together and hasn't figured out a way to counteract this. You also live in a country in which there is a huge number of armed people. There are groups of militias. There's been deep suspicion ironically, of the return or attempt to return the monarchy in any form. There is an anti-federalist energy. Is there a possibility or even a likelihood of actual violence?
Well, there's violence all the time in America. I mean, it happens every day, precisely for the reasons that you're pointing out here. Mass shootings, school shootings, people resorting to gun violence in any kind of dispute, road rage, you name it. I mean, America is a violent society. And it's always present at any particular time. The question is whether it coalesces, behind anything specific, whether it remains at a kind of community or communal, level, or it really, translates into something bigger than that. You see already, a lot of resistance, protests and things to, the actions of ICE and National Guard presence. And this is a dangerous time, absolutely for sure. I just can't say exactly how it's going to unfold. Is the federal government going to go head to head with some governors, in particular states? Or will, there be other formulas? Will Trump just try to buy people off, that he doesn't like? He obviously tries to intimidate everybody. Will he continue to get away with sending in the National Guard to other states? Because always the National Guards of other states. This is very much what Russia's done and the Soviet Union did. You can look back over, Soviet and Russian history and see many episodes of where, the equivalents of the National Guard or the military with soldiers from regiments from different places were sent in to put down local disorder, or what was presented as local disorder, which was really protest. The Soviet Union had tens of thousands of protests. We just never heard about them because they were always repressed. And if you think about how the Soviet Union came apart or was picked apart by elites in the final stages, it was because Gorbachev didn't want to do that. He didn't want to continue that practice of shooting at his own people, be there in places like Georgia or in the Baltic states, for example. There was a lot going on in that final stages, and Gorbachev pulled back from more repression, from more having, after several incidents of having soldiers, shoot at Soviet citizens. And that's, kind of really what, Trump is going to have to be called out for. He's trying to delegitimize everybody and legitimize his use of force. I mean, and it's a big question now for the UK as to whether to push back against this. The attack on the BBC, for example, that's an attack at the the very fundaments of UK democracy as well. Not to mention the support for Farage and GB News, and the support for the AfD in Germany, or Marine Le Pen, in France. The US and under Trump is actively now, in ways that perhaps Latin America was more familiar with, and it's doing it there again. In the 1970s, the US is actively involving itself in European politics, or at least this administration is.
That's a fascinating thing. I mean, you allude there, you mentioned the 1970s. That was during the red fear, if you like. It was the CIA toppling democratically elected socialist governments and infiltrating, causing civil wars to prevent the communists, broadly speaking, of getting a foothold. And those communists, in the American mind at any rate, probably in reality, drew their inspiration and funding or direction from Moscow. In terms of Moscow, the communists don't exist anymore. So what
Yeah.
is the why is America attempting to infiltrate effectively European and politics and define the debate here? That sort of thing we can understand to some extent. Putin wanting to do that. Why is Donald Trump? Unless, of course, it's to court favor with the Russian Tsar of today.
It's all for himself, but it's the same reason as Putin does, and actually with the same groups, honestly. But of course, Trump is bandying around all the time. Marxism, kind of socialist. He's just called Mamdani in New York, that although, he tends to talk about that himself. But the other way is that Trump tends to denigrate everybody by calling about the radical left, Antifa, calling everyone out. He's still using that old ideology because, it sells to many people. It still works with, kind of many of the groups. But really what he's trying to do, it's the same as Putin, is to try to basically promote like-minded parties, people who he thinks will, bend a knee to him. And, basically he's trying to influence politics for the United States advantage. Access for trade, more preferential deals, removing regulation, having a free hand in expanding US interests. That's no different from what Putin's doing. Putin says he wants to have demand for Russia all over the place, and that's what Trump wants as well. He wants to have the US having unfettered access. I almost said excess, but that's kind of another part of this as well. There's some demand degrees of excess around this as well. But I mean, he's just sort of seeing Europe, UK included, as vassal states and as opportunities, for trade, and again without any regulation.
Well,
So I
it's
just
interesting
think
you
that
said.
people have to wake up to see that, unfortunately. I mean, look, it's very painful to say that. I never in a million years expected I would be saying things like this. Never in a million years, until quite recently.
So what I mean, there has been, ironically, a little bit not pushback, but there's been a slight evolution of trying to think of a polite way of putting it, some steel in the spine, should we say, among some European leaders with regard to at least understanding that America, they're not going to be able to hand off all responsibility to America. But there's been no sign, and it intrigues me that there's been no real sign of people in the center of politics or the left even of actually pushing back at Trump, of actually calling out what is going on, and if they agree with you, which I think many of them do, that to some extent he's actually represent a threat to Western Europe and certainly to Western values. Why do you think that is? And indeed, am I
Yeah.
right?
Well, I think you are right, but I think it's not just a left issue, right? I mean, I think this is I said left and then right, but that's the problem. I don't think we know what left and right are anymore. We've got that, as many people talk about, that kind of horseshoe effect of, lots of ideas, kind of coming together and coalescing. I mean, again, you have Steve Bannon talking about himself as Lenin. And a kind of, this is sort of a Leninist, revolution, and they kind of want to take over. We're talking about, hard right views, the kind of views that, frankly, we've seen in the past that are reasserting themselves, and a desire to have a very small group of elites, kind of coalescing around a certain set of ideas and their own values, really take over at the expense of everyone else. So again, this is not really a left-right issue. It's about kind of a question of a sort of hostile takeover and merger, with a lot of people thinking they can make money out of all of this, and seeing, the nation states or, kind of European states in the UK as, targets for hostile takeovers. it is very much business-like and transactional. I mean, in some cases it is ideological. These guys have, they're mostly guys have got particular kinds of viewpoints that they want to assert, and they want to see everything else in their image. Again, this is a very old story, but and it doesn't mean that this has got to be the direction of travel forever. I mean, the United States remains a very vibrant society with, I mean, incredible things happening, across the United States and its economy and its polity. It's just that, there is now this administration that's got itself ensconced in its palace in the White House, which is starting to look like Caesar's palace in Las Vegas every moment, kind of taking in that kind of whole idea of being a casino with meme coins and all kinds of things. We're in a moment, a very, difficult moment for the United States where, kind of things can go in all kinds of different directions. And Europeans need to wake up and understand that. And, if it were, a lot of different European countries are in peril as well. God knows what's going to happen in France. Difficult times in Germany. All kinds of things happening in the United Kingdom. And I think this is just a lesson here that people have to get their act together, and they have to decide for themselves what's important to them, and then take that action and not be swayed by ideological precepts. I mean, we're trying to get, people are trying to impose their own ideologies, their own way of thinking on everyone. And that's not what people need at this particular time to deal with all the challenges that the world is throwing at us. It's the breakdown of one order has been going on for a very long time, and the beginning of something new. And often what happens when you've had some overarching global, or certainly larger meta-regional set of orders, you get something more local for a time before something else is built up. And I think that that's kind of where we're going to have to head. So the UK is going to have to make some, collective decisions, at regional and local level, not just at the level of Whitehall, and then, start to think about who are its current, partners, and who can it best, work with, be this on defence and security or in economic terms, and, do some reassessment, and, kind of think about, how can we best address the challenges we're facing, and not have everything driven by the United States. I mean, Trump controls the narrative. Why? He's one guy, and others are just kind of basically drafting along, in his wake at this particular moment, and we shouldn't be letting that happen. There needs to be a bigger discussion about this, which is one of the things that you're trying to do with this podcast, and others are again. And again, I would just challenge people to stop thinking about it in ideological terms, because that's been the problem here in the United States, thinking about this in partisan and this is left and this is right. I think you'll kind of find that the most people in the US and in the UK have shared interest in what they want to see, and it's not a question of whether you've got a left or a right viewpoint.
No, I mean, for me, it's a question of whether or not you've got a democracy in which you can express those and other
Exactly.
viewpoints.
Yeah, and that's the challenge, is kind of not suppressing debate. That's the one thing that, if you try to think charitably about J.D. Vance's Munich speech, I mean, which is the kind of height of hypocrisy, but he was right that people are not listening to their populations. And there is, a movement to have more citizens' assemblies, to get people more engaged in debate. It's not just at the parliamentary level in the Houses of Parliament, but, kind of in local arenas as well. Podcasts do that, local media does, but we need more of that. We need more of people discussing and thinking about things for themselves.
Now, on Ukraine, as I say, I've spent a great deal of time there, and what I find quite interesting about the Trump administration's effect is that it has helped with Putin's movement of this terrible term, the Overton window. The area of kind of acceptable discussion has been shifted from how does the West help defend Ukraine and help Ukraine effectively win, through now the debate centers around how can Ukraine be persuaded to give up on 20% of its territory but preserve what is left over in perpetuity, or at least for the foreseeable future. And that is essentially, to me, that delivers a victory to Putin in and of itself. But if Europe is facing these fragmentary factors, all of this provides more opportunity for Putin down the line, doesn't it? In addition to the fact that he may end up illegitimately gaining 20% of Ukraine.
Yeah, sadly it does. And I mean, again, this is on us to frame this in the right way. I mean, what we've got to remember here is that Putin set off to do a special military operation. I mean, he told himself, and then everybody around him, who were, kind of forced into this position, that it would be over very quickly, and everybody else outside believed him. If we go back to February 2022, everyone was, pretty convinced that Kiev would fall, so to speak, in a matter of days, if not hours, weeks. That, in other words, the government capitulate, Zelensky would be off, and somebody else would be there installed as a pro-Russian or certainly very malleable Ukrainian president. Well, that didn't happen. I mean, Putin has lost. He's failed. He failed to get Ukraine in the way that he intended to, and he's created just an incredible amount of devastation. And what we're trying to do now is blunt his ability to keep on devastating everything, including himself. I mean, over the long run, I mean, I don't foresee that anytime soon Russia is going to collapse, but he's done incalculable damage to the fabric of Russian society, to its demography, to its economy. It's now a totally war mobilized economy, which is going to be very hard to shift in a different direction, which also points in the way that you've kind of framed this question as to, doesn't look like this is going to be over anytime soon kind of idea. It also kind of points to the idea that Putin can't give this up because his whole economy, his whole society, his whole politics, his whole preservation of self revolves around having this war go on. I think it's very hard to see how he stops the war, how he moves into peacetime or just moves into more and more problems. Think about the demobilization of all of these people who've gone through the front in Ukraine, in Russia, not just in Ukraine, who come back grievously wounded, not just with prosthetic limbs, but also heavily armed and knowing how to fight. And that further criminalization of Russian society, further increase of violence in Russian society. We're talking about that here in the United States, of having militias and the effect of having so many people cycle through Iraq and Afghanistan on the US front. Well, think about that on the Russian front and just that devastating impact. I think it's extraordinarily difficult to think about how you make Putin stop and to miscalculate beyond just making it impossible for him to continue the war, either by making the front line where Ukraine is now completely defensible from the Ukrainian point of view, or just squeezing down Russia's resources. And again, given what you just said about that fragmentation, Putin's kind of betting we're not going to be able to do that. If you look around the kind of spectrum of Russian opinion, you can see that Russians want this war to stop. Certainly the elites and the technocrats around Putin want it to stop. They've lost a lot from it, but they don't want to have this at a loss to Russia. And Putin's the one person who really doesn't want to stop. You can see again analysis after analysis that sort of suggests that for Putin, it's easier to continue the war than it is to stop it. And I think that that's something that Trump and others haven't really picked up on. Trump's got a lot of leverage with Russia, but Putin, this is about his own self-preservation, the continuation of his own imperial presidency. And Trump's got much more leverage, which is why we're seeing the way that this discussion has gone about Ukraine to get the Ukrainians to give up and stop. But Ukraine capitulating, Ukraine giving Putin what he has got now isn't sufficient to put an end to this because, again, Putin's not going to be demilitarized at this point. He's not going to change the course of the Russian economy, and he's basically created enemies out of most of Europe. Even if some Europeans would love to get back to business as usual with Russia, that's just really not going to happen. And it's had all these knock-on effects elsewhere. It's scared the hell out of all of US allies. Seeing how capricious the United States has been about all of this. It's certainly given China and others ideas about how they can probably kind of put more pressure on Taiwan to avoid having a ruinous war. It's let all kinds of other countries around the world see that war can win if it's done under certain circumstances. It's also shown how ruthless Putin is and how little he cares about human life, be it Russians' lives or Ukrainians' lives or anyone else's for that matter.
Isn't it interesting, or at least I find it interesting, that at the beginning, back to 2014, when Ukraine was first invaded, most of the West refused to give any kind of lethal aid to the Ukrainians in spite of commitments made to preserve Ukrainian security. Even after 2022, and the full-scale invasion, again, it was very, very slow. There were lots of restrictions on all kinds of weapons, and this will sound familiar. You and I are of the same vintage. That kind of Whitehall official kind of steepling their fingers and men putting their fingertips together and saying, well, we got to be very careful of defeating the Russians. We all know what happened, in the First World War in 1917 or whatever. And my response was, well, would the world be a dangerous place if the Russian Federation did start to fly apart? It's an imperium. It has large numbers of oppressed peoples within it in terms of the contemporary Russian Federation. From my perspective, as a resident of the West, that would be unstable, but better than having an invading army on our doorstep. Am I wrong?
Well, I think if we look at about Russia falling further apart, I mean, that was really the big debate in the 1990s. That's actually what, Putin himself, has capitalized upon. I mean, he comes into the presidency as a wartime president against Chechnya, if we, think back that far, because Chechnya was that response to the removal of the Soviet Union. The Chechens, felt they had a really good case to saying, well, we can go too. We have 1 million people. We're on a border now, an international border. We've got kind of history of separateness, of otherness, and if all of these other, former Soviet republics, Ukraine, Belarus, you name it, can go, well, why can't we too? Well, the Russian Federation internally wasn't, set up the same way as the Soviet Union, which actually did give the rights, to republics to secede, even if, there was no expectation that they were going to actually exercise those. And of course, we saw an absolutely ruinous, horrific war, which was the biggest conflict on Russian soil since World War II, preceding now this incredible land war that we now have in the case of Ukraine. And the Russians eventually, under Putin, by rather horrific methods, subjugated and repressed the Chechens. I don't think that we're likely to see anyone try, the Chechen secession again in Russia, but I think we can really see the weakening of the centre happening again, as it was in the 1990s under Yeltsin, with various republics having to take matters into their own hands more, and kind of spinning away, further and further from Moscow. And you're already seeing other former, Soviet states, all the countries that Russia tried to keep under its grip, doing a lot of things themselves. That's really been a consequence of this conflict. Armenia, Azerbaijan, looking to the US to help them, kind of broker a peace deal and not wanting kind of Russia, involved. The Georgians, even though they've kind of moved, back towards Russia, still being, kind of much more cautious about this. Kazakhstan, other countries trying to, make it out of the exits. Moldova, Belarus is stuck because of its, support for Putin in the war in Ukraine, and also because they've got this union treaty. But you can really see these centrifugal forces already there at work, and Putin is worried about that. Absolutely, he's worried about that, which is again why he wants to show that war wins and that Ukraine can't completely get away, because yes, he is worried about that. Now, should the rest of us be worried? I think what the rest of us should be worried about is this a kind of failing, flailing Russian state kept together with repression, with a lot of internal violence, and kind of more of a desire to lash out at all of us. But they're doing that all the time anyway, right? So this isn't something that we've got to just look forward in the future. It's happening now. That's why I keep saying we're at war with Russia, even though I get pushback against this all the time. The acts of sabotage, what just happened in Poland, all kinds of lasers and sensors and GPS blocking, and people say, well, that's not really war, hybrid war. Well, Putin thinks it is. Putin's trying to do whatever he can to subvert and to, basically, have a war by means other than having an outright confrontation with NATO. But he's certainly confronting NATO. He's certainly trying to expand, the field of battle and information and propaganda. In fact, he seems to be winning. I mean, all the time that I hear people taking Russia's side and Russia's talking points, he's definitely got the edge in the propaganda and information wars, because people were more likely to feel very negatively and badly about their own countries. I mean, all of us criticize our own countries because that's what democracy is for, but that doesn't mean that we should then be feeding into celebrating what Putin's doing, or saying that Russia's got it right, as a lot of we see the far right doing right now in the United States and elsewhere. So, but in that regard, Putin has managed to create a lot of fellow travelers. Strange bedfellows perhaps, but not so much because, Putin has, you were saying before, he has the ear of Trump and he has, basically a lot of capacity to influence others as well. He's got a lot of money that he's sloshing around. For Putin, this is war. This isn't peace. This is all a kind of a war for Russia's status in Europe and for its position.
But it seems incredible to me that a country with an economy that small, yes, it's got a lot of people, it's got a lot of land mass, but it's got a relatively small economy in comparison. We just talk about the European Union, even minus the United Kingdom, which sadly is no longer in the European Union, but you're still looking at some 500 million plus people, a gigantic economic bloc that has a massive capacity that seems to me to be largely unused in defense of itself against. He gets a hell of a bang for his buck, doesn't he?
Yes, he really does, and I mean the patterns that he has perfected, other people are emulating now because they've seen how successful he can be. I think Putin's the first populist president of the 21st century. He's certainly
Which is ironic, given that he's an authoritarian, didn't get
yeah,
elected.
but this is authoritarian populism. It's kind of, and a lot of these other people prefer not to get elected and just to look. Trump keeps talking about not bothering to have elections again, and
Yeah.
it'll be, not much of a surprise if that's the same viewpoint of the AfD or, the Le Pen, acolytes or, people in the UK. It's just like, just dispense with it all. We'd much rather be able to assert our authority and to manipulate the media. And that's again why it's so important to have discussions like this and for everybody to be having these discussions. Make up your own bloody mind. Don't just let them tell you what you should be thinking. And I mean, that's actually why I always have an aversion to ideology, because it's kind of people get, so, caught up in their ideologies and just the simplicity and the beauty and the attractiveness of like a realist theory or that theory. And, it kind of makes sense of a very complicated world. Well, the world is very complicated and there's no, kind of, one way of kind of reaching answers. I mean, there are right answers, to be got there. There is a truth that's out there, but sometimes it's difficult to get to it because you have to deal with all of this complexity. You have to ask a lot of questions. You have to be open to hearing, different sides of an argument, and that's what these guys are not. Trump and Putin are both people telling you what to think. Look what Trump has just said. He called, a journalist, kind of a piggy for asking a question, or said that somebody else was insubordinate, another woman, from asking a question, didn't like the way questions were asked. Don't let people tell you you can't answer, you can't ask questions and find answers for yourself. This is what this attack on the BBC is about. It's not about, kind of just, really bad editing job, on the place of Panorama. It's about, getting rid of an institution like the BBC that, for all its flaws, was set up to be a kind of a GPS for information, for people being able to ask questions and to get answers to them back in the 1920s at exactly the same time that the Soviet Union with its big propagandist machine was being set up. People seem to forget, as they're always quoting Orwell, that Orwell worked for the BBC. And although everyone has criticised it, the whole idea was that it was supposed to be there as a source of information for people, to be able to make up their own minds. It was also set up to give producers as much autonomy as they liked, in the way that you have it, kind of not as part of the BBC, but as part of the kind of independent and thinking about podcasts. Everyone was supposed to be that equivalent of people who could go out there and try to ask questions, not necessarily shape the answers, but actually be able to ask questions and have debate and discourse. And that's why an attack on that kind of institution is an attack on everybody, an attack on everybody's ability to access information and to be able to ask questions and have a healthy conversation and discourse about issues.
Have the British government, has it been pusillanimous in its dealings with Trump? Are we being too wet?
I think we've been in a very weak position. But, look, you can look at Putin, and you just said this again. You can play a weak hand very effectively, and we need to just do better at that.
What should they be doing?
Well, they should be building up, different ways of building up their own resources and, leaning into that and moving more quickly and being bolder. I mean, I know that, again, the government is running scared of both the left and the right at the moment, but there are all kinds of things that can be done, and you need to not be afraid of your public. You need to have open conversation, and you need to not just think of everything through the prism of London either. You need to have, real capacity an enabling power given to other parts of Britain, and to give people a voice and kind of a chance to be able to do things for themselves. I mean, that's the thing I found incredibly frustrating about the UK. I took part in the strategic defence review as one of the reviewers. I found actually that's a very uplifting exercise, as well as somewhat horrifying, and all the kind of ways that one would think about worrying about the future of UK defence and the capacities that it had. But I also found it uplifting because we did engage with a very large number of people, or 8,000 submissions on how people should think about defence. We had citizens' assemblies of people who went to bases and talked to people, and people had great ideas. And there was a real discourse happening that seems to have not died a death, but kind of become more muted after that. But the frustrating thing is that people can't look outside of Whitehall. The big thing where things kind of got held up was this cross Whitehall. Well, what about cross country? What about thinking about, kind of the various nations of the United Kingdom? It isn't just about England. I got up to the north of England, and there's all these St. George flags put everywhere. But what is England? There is not even a debate about, how different London is from all of the other UK regions, how different the northeast of England is from Greater Manchester, for example. How do you get a kind of place-shaped approach to these things? England is not the sum of even parts at this point. And with the devolution of power, to Scotland, and tax levying, capacity, and to some degree some devolution to Wales, and autonomy for Northern Ireland, and kind of going back to self-rule, we need to be thinking more actively about the future of England, and not have Vladimir Putin thinking about that for everybody, or Donald Trump shaping that. It's not just a question of the separation of powers between Parliament and the monarchy. I mean, Trump's obsessed about the king and the royal family at the moment, but how does England function within the United Kingdom, not just Scotland and Wales, and how does all of this get bound together? I mean, I would just challenge people to just go and travel north and just see how much things change there, because so many parts of Britain are not just left behind, they're left out of mind. And that was really something that I thought was even, a feature of the Strategic Defence Review. A lot of focus on Barrow-in-Furness. How many people have actually been to Barrow-in-Furness is a good question. I have to rent a car whenever I visit the north, because you just can't get there from here on so many, kind of levels. The lack of discussion now about transportation. UK is not mobile. People just can't get from here to there in many, different places, let alone social mobility, geographic mobility. And sometimes, the UK doesn't feel fit for purpose, and it's not going to be, basically resolved by debates from the left or the right, or kind of about just immigration. There's going to be, I mean, that's a big issue, a really big issue. I think there should be a commission put together for a sensible discussion about it, not a politicized discussion, although it's very hard given the raw feelings about this for understandable reasons. But there are so many issues that have to be decided on a national level, not just in one place for one place and by people from one place. And that, I think, is the real challenge that the UK faces right now.
It sounds to me that sort of from a kind of emotional, but also a deeply intellectual perspective, you're seeing a lack of ideas when you're back in the old country.
I mean,
Are we short of
a lack of
ideas?
boldness. I don't think we are short of ideas. I just think we're just not engaging everybody in coming up with those ideas. Lots of great ideas. They just don't get implemented because they can't get traction, because there's only one way into the system. How is Nigel Farage getting so much traction? Because all the the media is focused on him all the time. He's got his own GB News. I mean, this is just, again, everybody now is a media personality. And how do you kind of break through all that noise? Well, again, I think you have to take things back to the regional and local level, and that's supposedly what MPs are supposed to be doing. It's certainly not what's happening in the US Congress. They're not representing their constituencies, and they've ceded any authority to Trump. But I mean, I think this is a challenge for the UK, and a particularly a challenge of articulating, what power and responsibility means in an English context. What is England? If you look at Northeast England, for example, the Northeast, it's got a much stronger regional identity than it has an English identity, despite the appearance of St. George flags. It's as strong an identity as it is in Wales and Scotland. Other places less so. I think you need to have much more of a sense of being in communion and in communication with the rest of the country. I think, that's why, Whitehall or the political parties have kind of lost their way. They're not getting full representation, full voice, from the country.
Is this why you constantly hear this sort of panic stations in both the Labour and in the past in the Tory party about the so-called red wall? I mean, I've always been kind of amused by this idea that there was some kind of sort of tribal group that needed to be appealed to or fed some kind of red meat of politics up there somewhere in the windswept north where people have unintelligible accents, which I note with relief that you've moderated for my benefit.
I've got my dad's telephone voice on. My dad always we'd laugh at him. We'd go on the telephone. We said, what do you do? He says, well, people have got to understand me. So my dad's telephone voice is, in operation right now, because that's exactly the issue. Look, it's a 2 millennia problem, a 2 millennia old problem. The Romans had the same, issue. They built a bloody wall, a real wall, not just a red wall, a stone wall up there, because they also, had the same, kind of problems of not wanting to devolve power. I mean, Rome never devolved power from Rome, although they had, consuls and, kind of governors and things that they kind of sent out there to run everything from the center and then from, the various forts all the way into places. And we've got the same problem there. I think, people don't really understand their own country. And, I would just challenge people to just bloody well get out of London and go and see your own country. It's not that big. The UK is not that big. I mean, I talked to Americans who've spent time in England, and one of them, in fact, I was meeting with yesterday, or the UK, kind of quipped at me that that they really understood that for the first time that history kind of is in the US context of a couple of hundred years is not very long, but that they could never get their heads around that 200 miles was a really long way in a kind of an English sense, where it's just a day trip, kind of in a US context, not quite, but kind of not far off. And I think that that's kind of people's mental maps of Britain seems to be enormous. The Romans exaggerated the size of Scotland to justify why they couldn't take it over. But this is a kind of a a perpetual problem, I think, for people in the UK. They need to get a better grip of their own country, and then they wouldn't be running so scared and freaked out by the idea of this implacable group of God knows who with, again, as you said, impenetrable accents in different places, wanting something that they don't know about. Everybody wants the same thing. They want to have the ability to lead a reasonably good life, a decent life for themselves and for their families. Not everybody wants a bloody yacht or, to cloak their house in gold and have a gold toilet, in every bathroom. People, want to be able to kind of, hope to have a good education, be able to get a job, have skills. Have a chance, to not be living in poverty. That's kind of, the basic bottom line here.
You mentioned Rome, and we're coming to the end of my time slot with you, so I've got two last questions. You mentioned Rome there, and it always triggers in me mention of Rome the notion that the West is going through a decline and the next stage is a fall. Are we at the end of the Western era?
Definitely at the end of this particular version of it. So, we're in one of those periods, definitely, of change. I hesitate to use the word transition because we used to talk about that in the Soviet Union, the idea that after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, Russia was in transition to something we thought was meant to become France or Poland or kind of some other country. Yeah, and as you remember, and that it just transitioned to being itself again. Kind of. So I think we are going to find different formulations here. I've been thinking a lot about Rome, as I look at what's happening in the White House. And again, Trump looks like he's building Caesar's Palace, Vegas style, all the time.
Yeah,
and,
or Caligula. Is there going to be a horse in the Senate?
Yeah, there's just all kinds of, things that we realize that there's nothing really new in the world, and history definitely rhymes. And, we come back on ourselves, even as we're always moving forward. And I think that's the thing to bear in mind. We always move forward. Even if, some of the problems of the past, rear their heads again, which is certainly the case now. I mean, we are in a period reminiscent of the 1920s, as I said before, which is again the end of, really those monarchical eras, the imperial eras, the end of empires. You had the collapse of the Kaiser and the German Reich, which actually wasn't very long lived anyway, since the unification of Germany in the 1870s. But you definitely had the collapse of the British Empire as a result of that. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire. We left that imperial age and moved on to something else. And I think we're leaving the end of a world dominated by the United States, and the United States is giving it up. But maybe we're also for a period leaving kind of an age that has to be dominated by centers. And America is not going to be calling the shots anymore, but it's also not going to be what we saw in the past. This is not going to be in a battle of the great titans, not in a bipolar or multipolar, even if we feel all a bit bipolar at the moment, in a multipolar world. It's not just going to be the United States, China and Russia in the place of the Soviet Union duking it out. We've got Brazil, we've got Indonesia, we've got India, we've got South Africa, we've got all kinds of countries, the Gulf states, the Saudis, we've got all of these players out there, and we could go on and on who would like their time in the sun as well, and are thinking about regional orders and new ways of interacting. So we're in a time of change, and then we've got all the rapid change that we're seeing from technological change, the emergence of AI. It's just a difficult period. Climate change, whether people want to deny it or not, things are definitely in flux here. And so we've got to figure out, how do we adapt to that? How do we deal with that? And what is going to make the most sense in that context? Where is maybe there going to be multiple centers rather than one center that dominates everything?
So my last question with all of my interviewees in the world of travel is, do we have any reasons to be cheerful, to quote the great Ian Dury?
We do. Look, Ian Dury himself is somebody who overcame incredible adversity. I mean, he had polio,
Yeah.
and and kept on going, and and an incredible spirit. I loved Ian Dury and the blockhead. So I think that's what we need. We need a bit more of a blockhead in the sense of keeping on going. Basically remembering that we do have agency. We can do things, and we've just got to remember that. Well, look, this is another crisis. It just might not be taking the forms that we're familiar with, but it is a crisis. Britain is under siege, information, wise, politically, many other ways, literally trying to deal with floods of people coming in, not really knowing how to manage all of this. We need to get our act together. We can get our act together. We've done it before, and honestly, we can do it again, but it won't be necessarily through silver bullets coming out of Whitehall. I mean, the UK is replete with actually great stories if we go out and look for them, rather than just having the American carnage or UK carnage approach and listening constantly to Nigel Farage or anybody else, talking the country down all the time.
Fiona Hill, thank you so much. That was fascinating. I wish I could talk for steal another hour of your time. And any chance you're going to come back here and get into politics? It sounds like we could probably do with you.
I don't want to run for government because, again, you end up having to pander, to special interests. And, I think that what we need to do is, again, keep motivating people to do things for themselves in civil society. So I'm trying to, find a way, of a platform for this. I don't want to be out there, because, when you're out there asking for people's vote or asking for people's money, you want something, right? I don't want anything.
Yeah.
I want to see some change as well, and I want to see how I can be part of making that change happen.